Hi everyone, welcome to episode 66 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. My guest for today's episode is Jodie Auster, the GM of UberEATS Melbourne. Jodie started her career as an emergency doctor before going to business school. She then joined Scoopon as an early hire and as the general manager of operations oversaw the growth of the company from 50 to 110 employees, enabling a doubling of the number of deals offered per week and generating 50% increase in weekly gross profit. She then moved to San Fran to join Thumbtack, originally as the director of customer operations before becoming the vice president for people at the organization, overseeing 4 funding rounds totaling $267 million in funding, 10x in revenue growth, and 15x growth in people. In late 2016, she moved back to Australia and took over as the GM of UberEATS Melbourne, one of the first cities in the world to launch Uber's new product. In this interview, we discuss hiring ahead of your needs, the importance of understanding the unit economics of your business, customer experience debt, and hypothesis-driven problem solving. Without further ado, here is my interview with Jodie Auster. Hi Jodie, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yes, absolutely. So at the moment, I am the general manager of Melbourne for UberEATS, and I've had a fairly circuitous path to get here, which I think is interesting to share. So I started off life as an emergency doctor and then went to business school part-time while I was working in medicine full-time, quite like that. Ended up at Bain for a couple of years and then was lucky enough to be called by a school friend who had started Catch of the Day, and he asked me if I wanted to come and interview for the role of GM of operations of Scoopon, which I did and got the role, spent a couple of years there, then took off to San Francisco where I ran customer operations and then people operations for a business called Thumbtack. We moved back at the end of last year and I started at UberEATS then. And I think, what people ask me is, how do you make sense of that journey? How did you get from A to B to C to D? And I think the common thread for me is I really like unpacking complex problems. And what I learnt in medicine was hypothesis-driven problem solving. You're standing at the foot of the bed with a patient and you have to decide pretty quickly, is this person sick or well? What do you think the answer is? You then do a set of pretty targeted tests because most of them involve radiation or a needle, and you prove or disprove your answer, and you do that rapidly under a fairly sort of high-pressure environment. So I've taken that skill set with me and that approach into business, and it's actually quite a nice fit in the startup world because of the pace of decision making and change.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to ask, what were some of the learnings of being an emergency doctor that you're sort of applying to your current role or through your sort of career? Because my business partner, Dear, who we were just sort of talking about as well, very similar sort of background. He was in medicine and then jumped into business. What was that sort of transition like for you?
So I think in hindsight, the way that you are taught to think in medical school is really useful for the world outside of medicine. And I think it's not only that scientific method, that hypothesis-driven problem solving, but it's keeping you cool under pressure. It's explaining complex concepts to people who don't understand those concepts. And in emergency, it's triage, which is really useful in a fast-moving business environment. On the sort of practical side rather than the intellectual side, the first week that I was working at Bain was quite hilarious because I was used to starting a medical shift in the emergency department at sort of 7:30. So I turned up at 8 to the Bain office. No one was there. I didn't know how to really sort of, move through an office environment very well. I didn't understand how to use the phone system. I didn't know email etiquette. And so the transition was quite clunky in a practical sense. But I think intellectually and in terms of way of thinking and approach to problem solving, I was better set up for success than I realised.
Sure. And you mentioned hypothesis-driven
problem solving.
Problem solving. How does that, obviously when you're in a startup, especially when it's moving as quickly as I imagine Scoopon was and some of the other roles that you've had, how do you sort of stick to that, or how do you sort of apply that process when there are so many different moving parts and things are just moving so quickly?
Yeah, I think that method helps me navigate the breadth and pace because, really crudely, there's two ways of solving a problem. You can go and collect a whole bunch of information and then distill that eventually down into the answer, which is, I think, a lot of the way a lot of the world approaches problem solving. And it's slow, and I think it's inefficient because usually at least half of the information that you collect turns out to be irrelevant to the answer. And so starting with an answer, so in medicine, you start with what you think the diagnosis is and you refine it. At Bain, that was actually called answer first problem solving. So it's in the first hour, have an answer. In the first day, refine that answer. In the first week, have an answer. And as time goes on, your answer gets better and better, but you always have an answer that you are trying to refine and improve. And so in the startup world, I like that approach because you don't always have time to work on a problem for a week or a month or many months, but you've at least got to a decision point early so that you can keep moving. And so you have to be comfortable with your 1 hour or 1 day decision, which might be 60% right or 80% right, but you've got something to work with. And you then need to decide, okay, is this a decision where that method's okay? Or do I need to be more detail oriented and more precise and do more iterations on this particular decision? So an example would be sort of safety and compliance. That's not something that's okay to do a 1 hour answer first. You need days and often weeks to refine and iterate on that answer to get it, 99% right. But particularly something that's not customer facing and doesn't have huge risk or huge business impact, usually the 1 hour answer is great and you just need to collect a little bit of information to test whether that's right. But if you start with the other method and you just go collect a bunch of information and you spend a lot of time building up to that answer, you'll never be able to get anywhere in an hour. So that's how I apply it in this environment.
Is it difficult? Obviously, you've had quite senior roles as well. Is it difficult then to get the rest of your team members on board with that? Or are there any strategies you use to spread that process in decision-making process across your teams?
It's a great question. I probably should invest more time helping my team be comfortable with that approach, because I think the most common hurdle that junior people that I work with face is prioritization, time management, and knowing when to stop working on a problem or a decision. And all of those three concepts are related, right? If you prioritize badly and you don't manage your time well and you are a perfectionist for every single piece of work that you're doing, you get into a real state. And so what I try and help my team do is really rigorously prioritize and have a short prioritization list. That's a bit easier to teach than this sort of answer first method. But I do, occasionally sit in front of a whiteboard with the team and say, okay, let's actually go through this in the way that I would do it in medicine or at Bain. Let's write the hypothesis at the top of the page, and then let's write a comprehensive set of things that need to be true for that hypothesis to be true or false. And then let's circle the boxes that are the ones we're least sure about and go away and find that information. And so usually when people have sort of seen that whiteboard exercise once or twice, they're like, oh, I'm starting to get this. If I don't do a session with the team like that, then I'm really big on people writing things down in, not quite in prose form, but in a Google document that says, here's the context, here are the principles I'm thinking about, here's my approach. And it does sort of serve the same purpose. If you actually do have to sit down and say, this is what I'm looking at and here's how I'm going to approach it, you have to have a hypothesis to do that.
Absolutely. It's funny you mentioned that. I actually just came from a meeting with a founder, and I see this happen a lot where they're finally looking, they're about to launch, they've got a product in market, and now they're trying to figure out a marketing or a growth strategy. Mm-hmm. they're like, there's 20 different things that we want to do, but we don't really know where to start.
Yep.
And so that's, so I've kind of mentioned this previously on the show, but I launched a company called Playbook Media. And so what we do is data-driven storytelling, which is the whole idea is, what are the hypotheses? What are the different channels? Who are the different customer segments? Can we get metrics on, what is the engagement level across all of these things? It's not going to be perfect, as you mentioned. It's not going to be 99% right, but you've got some level of data to work with for you to be confident to some degree of like, okay, we know that this particular strategy will be more effective, and we can sort of at least start off with that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So coming back to your experience with Scoopon as well. So you joined them at a relatively early stage as well, is that correct?
Yeah, I joined, I think it was October 2011, and I was probably about the 50th person in the Scoopon team. And it was post a pretty large investment from Tiger Global into the Catch of the Day group. So I really can't remember exactly how old Scoopon was. I want to sort of say 18 months old as a business. And it was really at the peak of the daily deals industry. That industry was flying. It was so popular with consumers. There were multiple competitors in the market. And on the outside, it looked like it was going incredibly well. So it was a pretty interesting time to join. I think what actually played out over the next couple of years was there were quite a few cracks in the model in terms of the sustainability of the deals for small businesses and kind of the risk management steps that we needed to go through when we were putting together a deal to make sure that it was sustainable for the business and for the people buying the deal. And that played out with a few deals that fell over, and we learnt some important lessons.
It's really interesting that you kind of mentioned the outside perspective of what it's like, because obviously in terms of a lot of the news stories that we hear, a lot of it is about exits and successful fundraising and hiring X number of people. It's hard to know what's really going on in the core of the business. What were there particular things that happened, or were there particular moments where you sort of questioned the long-term sort of sustainability of the model?
Oh, that's a big question. I think that in any business that is dealing with small businesses as their customer, so UberEATS is another one of these, Scoopon is another one, do the unit economics work for you who's selling this proposition to the small business? But it's actually really quite hard to understand, do the unit economics work for the small business? And so getting to the bottom of that, I think, is the place where you question, like, is this viable? And it's small businesses, they're so varied, right, even in the same industry, because there's such different levels of operational excellence. We're in the restaurant sector now in UberEATS, and there are some small, really savvy restaurant operators, and there are some small corner store people who are passionate about food, and their level of business savvy is really different, and that goes all the way through to big, private equity-backed restaurant groups who are really brilliant operators. So sort of getting behind the scenes with your small business partners to understand what are their economics, how do their businesses work, and is there upside in it for both of us here, is, I think, one of the most fascinating parts of having those businesses as your partners. And so what we started to do at Scoopon, and I think a lot of people in the daily deals industries ended up doing this, was learning how to explain the upside and the cost of a deal to a business, and then learning how to price it in a way that was sustainable for them and sustainable for us. And I just think that's a really important journey to go through, because if you build something that's just making money for you, eventually you're going to run out of customers, because it won't be sustainable for them.
Is there a particular stage that you think startups or founders should start thinking about the unit economics of their business?
Of their own business,
Mm.
right at the beginning. I think, when I was working at Thumbtack, there were quite a few competitors that fell over because they were scaling losses. So it's okay to me if you have a short-term loss-making unit, but you have to be able to see a path to profitability at a unit level, or at least at a portfolio level, because otherwise you'll go out of business. So Handy was the classic one in the US that was competing with Thumbtack in the cleaning vertical, and it was costing them more to acquire a customer than they were bringing in with a cleaning job. Well, that really probably should have been known right at the beginning before they hired a bunch of staff and scaled their business. And it's actually sort of horrifying to me that investors don't do that level of diligence when they invest, because it just creates this cycle of sort of false hope that business is sustainable.
Absolutely. In terms of the planning stage, so you mentioned that, and I guess a lot of sort of startups in a competitive industry sort of have to take a similar model of, we're prepared to take a short-term hit in terms of our unit economics for the longer-term gain. Is there, so you mentioned that there needs to be a path to profitability. Is there a particular sort of stage, or is there a particular time frame that you look at thinking, or is there a particular sort of stage that you feel companies should say, okay, after this point, is it feasible or is it not feasible, or is this actually going to work?
I don't know if I would listen to my personal advice on this. This is caveat. This is my opinion. I think in Australia it's much less common for people to go for a long time being loss-making and relying on outside investment to pull them through. I think people are much more comfortable with that in the US, and particularly in the Bay Area. But people are very critical of that approach, because the critics will say, well, if you haven't become profitable within X amount of time, how do we believe that you ever will be? I think the jury's still out on that. Are businesses that are massive and unprofitable but bridging the gap with investor dollars in it for the long haul? TBD. I hope so.
So again, you've kind of touched on sort of your experience in San Fran and some of the differences that are there. And obviously you've spent a fair bit of time in building fast-growing companies in both areas. What were some of the sort of differences that you noted, or some of the strengths of both the Australian and the US market?
Great question. I think the Australian landscape's changed a lot, even in the few years that I was away. So before I left, what I would have said about Australia, particularly in startup, was that there weren't a lot of people around who were willing to work at that pace and take that level of risk. It was kind of a pretty small community of crazy people. And so one of my biggest fears in coming back was, will I be able to find a place that has the appetite for speed and scale and, pushing the boundaries that I loved and experienced in San Francisco. And I've been absolutely thrilled to find how much the startup ecosystem's evolved in Australia towards that. And Uber and UberEATS is an incredible place to work in terms of that energy and that fire in people to run fast and to experiment and to really push the boundaries. So I feel very lucky to have landed here. I think something that I've learned that I've definitely brought back with me from San Francisco is much less of a distinction between who I am at home and at work. It was not part of my kind of work persona to really be myself before I worked at Thumbtack. And I don't know if it was just very Australian or very corporate, or I'm not really sure what it was, but it was almost demanded of me in San Francisco. I remember in the first couple of weeks working at Thumbtack, every single person I worked with had Facebook friended me, and I was totally mortified, because that just wasn't, LinkedIn was for professional friends and Facebook was for personal friends, and just crossing that line felt really uncomfortable for me initially. But what I learnt and what I relaxed into was just that mental energy that I used to spend being somebody a little bit different at work just freed up a whole bunch of time and headspace when I didn't have to use that worrying about having a different persona at work. And I'm just very appreciative of that because I am absolutely myself at work. I mean, within reason, you know, I'm probably a bit grumpier at home sometimes than I would dare be at work. But I do think it is a really wonderful part of San Francisco startup culture that you are the same person in and outside of work, and you form deep friendships with the people that you work with. And it is really encouraged both in sort of dress and communication and relationships to be you.
Is there anything that you would like to see more of in Australia, or something change?
I think the headline for that is probably risk-taking. And I say that coming from a place where I recognise that I'm incredibly privileged personally. And so if I take risks and fail, I do have a pretty big sort of personal and social safety net to catch me. And I understand that not everybody has that. But in the US, what that looks like is sort of fiercely independent, innovative individuals who chase success in a way that doesn't happen here. And sometimes I think it comes from just this is an easy place to live, and so there's no reason to cause discomfort in trying something difficult. But sometimes I also think it comes from a misconception that most doors that you walk through are one-way doors. And that's just not true for most things. Most decisions that you make, you can walk back through the door. And I think people in Australia, more than I saw in San Francisco, just agonise over these decisions, whether to walk through the door. You know, should I change jobs? Should I, take this risk in my product roadmap? I mean, everything from small to big things. I feel like in Australia there's much less of a desire to walk through that door than I saw in the States and in the Bay Area in particular. So just a recognition that you can go back on lots of decisions that you make, and there's real joy and often success and reward on the other side of just taking that leap.
So you've been part of 3 really fast-growing startups. Mm-hmm. What were some of the less expected challenges of scaling and growing those companies?
It is such a long list. So I think I'm going to divide that up into sort of people and process challenges. I think the thing that stands out to me across all 3 companies on the people side, 2 things. One is you always underhire, even though you think you couldn't possibly need that number of people. And I have always underestimated the level of experience that I'm going to need. And so what happens is the person that you've hired that you think is wildly overqualified for the role within 6 months is pretty underqualified for what you actually need. And so that's both in the scale of hiring but also the level of qualification of the hiring. The second thing that happens pretty consistently to me on the people side is as the business moves through different phases, and it moves really fast through different phases if you start early in that business, is you go from needing a really highly skilled group of, general athletes in inverted commas, so people who can do a bit of everything and are willing to do a bit of everything, towards specialisation. And as you go towards specialisation, some of the general athletes do not like that and often don't fit in to one of the specialty areas that you need. And so there is this really uncomfortable period, which I think for each of the businesses that I've been in is not uncommon, around the kind of the 2-year mark, where you have to sort of look a general athlete in the eye and say, pick a specialty, because we're going to need to narrow your scope and you're going to need to go a bit deeper than broad. And they either are like, I don't want to, in which case the answer is, okay, great, well, let me help you go and have this amazing journey that you've had here at another business at that same early stage, or they unfortunately don't have a natural specialty that they're good at. So they're sort of, jack of all trades, master of none. And then you have to have that conversation with them, which is, I don't actually think that you fit in any of these specialised areas or roles. And that's a much harder conversation to have. So, yeah, I think on the people side, so it's scale and level of experience in hiring. I have always underdone it. And then that uncomfortable stage from generalisation to specialisation and how you manage people through that. I think on the process side, it's just always this funny dance of the things that startups really have an allergic reaction to. They bite you always at some point. And so whether that is sort of financial controls and infrastructure, or HR controls and infrastructure, or, it's all the unsexy central functions that startups are like, oh, we don't need that. We're a startup. We'll look after that ourselves. You always wish you had started building that infrastructure earlier than you had. But by the same token, if you would have tried to introduce it at day one, that would have been silly. And so there is this interesting dilemma of, well, when is the right time to hire your first HR person, your first recruiter, your first accountant or CFO, or, when is the right time to invest in a pretty expensive system that will scale with the business. So there's processes, tools, and roles that you kind of look at with disdain for the first little bit, and then you're like, oh God, I really wish that I would have had that 6 months ago. And that's absolutely a common theme through the three businesses. And then I think the other thing is, from a process perspective, like this concept of debt that is commonly talked about in terms of technical debt, but I think exists in, I guess I would call it like customer experience debt, where you have built a minimum viable product or a minimum viable experience that kind of proves, yes, there is product market fit, this basically works, people will buy it and like tolerate it in its current state, but then you don't go back and fix those moments that are so key to the customer having a great experience with your product, because you're always looking forward and you're like, grow, scale, faster, like next product feature, but there are some core things that really need to be corrected, and it's quite painful to go back and do it because you feel like you're not really making progress. But I wish in all three businesses that we had done that better.
Sure. Just going back to your first point about people, and almost kind of like the cycles of different kind of roles that you sort of need. Has that changed, knowing what you know now, has that changed the way that you hire people now, or the process that you follow, or what you look for in the people that you're hiring?
The answer should be I have learnt from my lessons. But I've probably repeated them more than I would have liked to. I just think I'm less worried about overhiring in quantity and overhiring in skill level, because I have so many stories of where I wish that I would have done that. And so it's easier for me to convince people to say, what do we need in 12 months, not what do we need right now? And then I think the other thing is I'm more aware of, I wouldn't say I'm more organised in pipelining candidates. So this is something that's done like pretty badly in the world. But what I mean by pipelining is don't start sourcing and screening and recruiting people when you already feel the gap. Like always have a pipeline of candidates who have gone through the first few steps of the process, even if they're not looking, even if you don't think there's going to be a role for 6 or 12 months, it's really good practice to have a healthy pipeline for most functions in your business, so that when you need it, it doesn't take you 3 months to find that person. You've got somebody whose interest is already peaked, they've already done the first couple of steps in the process, and you just never know. It's always faster than you think it's going to be.
Again, sort of just going a little bit deeper into the people section. Were there any commonalities between the people that you did hire that ended up working out really well and between the people that didn't work out so well?
Yes. I am a big believer that your attitude, your willingness to learn and grow, and your, in some ways, like energy and passion are things that I would much prefer to hire for than skill. And so when I write a job description for a role that I'm going to open, I almost never, unless the recruiting team makes me, write down what do I think this person should have done, where do I think they should have come from, because I've been fooled by great resumes before and, you know, great experience on paper. And what I try and do is I say, well, what does success look like in the next 6 months? Like, what are the outcomes that I actually need in this role? And therefore, what does this person need to be good at to achieve those outcomes? And can I test really clearly for those skills? So, like for an example, we were hiring for a city marketing manager for Melbourne for UberEATS, and you know, one of the key outcomes was I wanted, you know, 2 large local partnerships to be executed on in the half. And so rather than say I need this person to have worked in, you know, agency or a marketing function of a large local firm, which is how people usually do it, I said, well, what skills do you actually need to find and negotiate and then execute on those 2 large partnerships? And then I need to be able to test, can this person, you know, identify strategic opportunities in the market? Can they negotiate at a senior level? Do they know how to execute a contract? Or like the intricacies of doing that. It doesn't mean they have to have done it, but do they understand what's important? Is it attention to detail, etc.? And then, you know, do they understand how to execute a project by themselves without a team? Because they're not going to have one. And I'll go and look for that. So it's sort of a really long-winded way of answering your question. It's about what sort of really fundamental skills do people have, not what experience have they had, and their mindset. You know, like I do believe in the sort of the Carol Dweck growth mindset thing, and I've achieved incredible things with wildly underqualified teams because those people had such self-awareness, such passion and energy and desire to learn and grow, that you just kind of get it done. And when you have a whole team like that together, you can achieve so much more than any individual can. I think one specific quality that I really appreciated at Thumbtack that is pretty important to me when I'm talking with a candidate is humility. I personally will almost never hire anyone who signals to me that they think they know everything and that they're the smartest person in the room, and they're not willing to ask for help from others. They're not willing to say they're wrong. Those are the hardest kinds of people to work with. And the founders of Thumbtack in particular were, for all their success and smarts, so humble and so willing to say, I might not be right and I'm going to go ask all of these other people for help and then integrate that information into their decisions. So that's a really important one for me. And then the second one that I look for at all levels is, have you got kind of just like commercial sense? And that's different if you're a grad to if you're 20 years out. So I can kind of flex that up and down depending on where you're at. But like some people come in and they interview and they'll present to you what they think is the most fantastic idea, and you just ask a couple of questions about, well, let's imagine that you started tomorrow and now you have to actually put that in market, and they have not sense checked in any way that their idea will work in practice. So it's just, are they kind of aware of what humans are like and what the world is like, and will their ideas actually land in a practical way? And as they get more senior, like, do they understand the business trade-offs that they're going to have to make in this situation? Because there's always the perfect answer, and then there's the reality of the world that you work in. And if I don't see that people have that business acumen, that common sense, that's often a red flag for me, because you can hire a genius that's completely impractical, and it often doesn't go well.
Sure. Obviously, Uber Eats has really sort of taken off over the last... Has it been 18 months or 2 years since?
So Uber Eats launched in Melbourne in April 2016, and it was one of the first international markets outside of the US and Canada. Yeah. So what does that make us? 15, 16 months old?
Wow.
But most other cities in the world are not that old.
Yeah. What have been some of the lessons from growing Uber Eats from the ground up here?
I mean, lots of the ones I've mentioned already. I'd say on the business side, a three-sided marketplace is exponentially harder than a two-sided marketplace. And so we have the supply and demand balancing act, not just between, rider and driver, like on the rides business, but eater and restaurant and eater and delivery partner, and that is on a hyper-local level with a perishable product in real time. I mean, like it doesn't get harder than that. So I have confirmed that I love marketplaces, but I also have learned that scaling a three-sided marketplace is not just a little bit, but it's a lot harder than scaling a two-sided marketplace. And I guess like on marketplaces in general, just that you're never in equilibrium. Like I always laugh when I talk to people and they're like, yeah, and then we'll build our supply and then we'll get our demand to a certain level and kind of like then we're done. So you are never done, because one always grows faster than the other, and you have to have strategies for each example of when it's out of whack. Like what happens when we have too many eaters versus restaurants and delivery partners? What happens when we have too many delivery partners? What happens when we have too many restaurants? And they all have their pains and patches, I guess, because it doesn't last long. And so then you learn not to despair too much when it's out of equilibrium, and to be really agile when it swings in a different direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's on the business side. I think on the people side, is there something new that I have learned here? I think I've just been really pleasantly surprised about just like the quality of people that has been assembled in this business. Like the team I worked with at Thumbtack was the most exceptional bunch of people I thought I had seen under one roof. And I thought, you know what, it's because it's in San Francisco and it's a Sequoia-backed company, and I'm at the peak of the best team I'm ever going to work with. And I was quite despondent coming back. And so I've learned that no, like the quality of talent certainly exists in Australia, and Uber in particular has done an amazing job of assembling a really, really exceptional team. And so I shouldn't bag Australian talent ever again.
I guess you've touched on this a couple of times in terms of like looking ahead and hiring ahead of what your sort of needs are, and also when you sort of talked about in a marketplace when you have, as you mentioned, never an equilibrium, and you have to have strategies in place. Is there anything that you use to plan or structure or develop those processes? Because I feel, again, a lot of the startup founders that I meet, a lot of it tends to be, it's just chaos. There's just a million moving parts, and a lot of their decision making tends to be reactionary versus this is our plan or this is our process.
Yeah, I mean, we're not entirely different to that. And, Uber Eats, I think, is a small business within a big business. And so we do feel some of the benefits of being part of that big business, and we do have some more structured planning and tools than you would if we were just 18 months old. On a really practical note, it is about scheduling the time to plan. And so I am a very big proponent of quarterly offsites. I put a huge amount of time and effort into structuring those days, and we do a look back and a look forward. And I think it's important to get off-site and get out of the business as usual environment and really reflect on, well, what did we achieve and how did it go? And we give business feedback, but we also give personal feedback to the team. And then we do, depending on how big the team is, you can do half a day look back and half a day look forward. But last quarter I needed a full day look back and a full day look forward. And if you do take that time out, it really pays off in the quarter that follows, because you sit down and you say, okay, what is it that we're aligning around? And therefore, what are the goals that we're committing to as a team? And then that cascades, right? So then I say, okay, here are the top level goals that we've agreed on as a team. How does that translate to a set of goals for your sub team? And then for you individually, what are you committing to? And we put that in just Google Sheets as a goal tracker. And every week, you're expected to update it. So that's one piece of rigor. I think the other thing that's happening to us a lot now is moving from a week-to-week reaction to a 4 or 8 or 12-week forecast. And it's really hard to do that because, in a sense, it's sort of much quicker and easier to go, okay, here's what happened last week, now let's plan for this week. And you do have to stop and put in a bit more effort to say, all right, what do I think that's going to look like 4 weeks out? And then you can edge that to 8 weeks out and 12 weeks out. And that's both on your business numbers, but also your resources. So if you think that you know what the business is going to look like in 4 or 8 or 12 weeks, you can then much more clearly say, oh, okay, I'm not going to have enough people to do the work that needs to be done in 12 weeks' time. Therefore, let me actually do the work now to hire those people. But I completely understand and am often in the situation where I'm like, oh, I didn't actually look what was going to happen in 12 weeks' time, and so I have not prepared for the fact that I'm under-resourced and I start recruiting too late. But that's kind of the ideal cycle for me. I think it's unrealistic in a business that's less than 2 years old to do more than quarterly planning. We try, but I'm currently sort of negotiating with facilities for potentially a bigger office, and it's like, well, they're like, what's your headcount going to be in 12 months? I'm like, oh my God, I have no idea. I could do a high-low estimate, but the variance is going to be massive.
So on sort of processes and structure, do you have your own personal structure, like day-by-day structure, or how do you sort of go about being efficient?
Oh, I'm much more chaotic than I would like to be as an individual. It's probably relevant to know that I have a 2 and a 6-year-old, and so that creates like a whole world of things that you can't control. Your kids need things and get sick, and just, the morning often doesn't go according to plan. So for me, that's been about trying to rush less to make sure that, because, otherwise, like, work and kids just sort of butt up against each other quite a lot. And so now it's like, okay, I don't take meetings before 9:30 so that we can have a fast or a slow morning and it's okay. Then I'm actually trying this new Gmail plugin called Sorted, SORTD, which is kind of like a Jira board, but it's it's a Gmail plugin. And so you can basically have these cards as to-do lists, and you can have as many lists as you want, and you can tag your emails as lists. But to be honest, I've been through like 100 cycles of tools and plugins and different things, and I haven't ever found something that works really well for me in terms of prioritization. I have like a couple of habits that work really well for me at the moment. One is I am totally okay with inbox not zero, which I think is something that people spend a lot of time striving to achieve, and my personal view is that it is time wasted. And so if you're in an organisation like this, I get hundreds and hundreds of emails a day, and I'm in meetings 99% of the day. So there's not obvious time to read email, and so I will scan my inbox probably every 2 hours during the day. And then at the end of the day, I'll clear probably 2 pages worth of email, and anything beyond that, I assume that people will get in contact with me again if it's important, and I haven't responded. And that is working really nicely for me, although most people would have massive anxiety with, I think I've got like 15,000 unread emails in my work inbox already. And Yeah, I think the other thing, I was going to say, do I have any like other really good habits that are worth sharing? I do really like walking meetings because I think it's really hard to fit in just sort of physical movement and fresh air during the day. And so it's a bit hard because I also like to take a lot of notes in meetings because I don't have a great memory. So I have to trade that record for the walks around the block. But it's actually really noticeable. Our Melbourne office is on the ground floor in Cremorne, and lots of people do walking meetings. The Sydney office is up in a tower on George Street, and no one ever goes outside. And I think it's really important, if you can, choose somewhere as a founder that has outside access, if you've got that luxury, and try and take 2 of your meetings doing laps, and it makes a really big difference to just be able to clear your head and get things going. And then the last thing I'll say is it's a massive goal of mine to try and get more than 7.5 hours sleep every day. I have a 2-year-old that sabotages that pretty badly, but if I do, I feel really great in a week where I've done lots of walking meetings and I've slept really consistently, and then I'm actually just better equipped to manage the chaos that is my day, because the truth is I don't have a ton of systems and processes that get me through. There's lots of unexpected surprises, and you just got to roll with the punches.
Sure. So on that note, Jodie, thanks so much for being on the podcast and for sharing your insights, experiences and tips. For anyone that wants to get in touch, maybe not via email, but
I'm not very fast at responding, and I may not respond at all.
What's the best way for someone to say hello, find out more, get in touch?
You are welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn with a message, and I usually won't accept the connection until I've had a bit of a conversation with you. So please send me a message, and happy to have a back and forth on LinkedIn if it's relevant. If you want to tweet at me, I'm Dr. Jodie A. DoctorJodiea. Those are probably the 2 best ways.
Perfect. I'll make sure all of those links are on the show notes. Jodie, once again, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to episode 66 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Jodie, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 67 next week.